this is basically exactly what I need. Welcome back to another episode of Russell Mod. We're back on the 1961 Rambler station wagon that we're trying to get ready for Hot Rod Power Tour. So in the last episode, you saw us paint the motor and transmission, and it came out really awesome. And we put the motor in the Rambler, but now we got to get this thing put back together so that way we can make Power Tour. We only have a few weeks left, so we got to get a lot of work done. So one of the last things we got to do underneath is finish the exhaust. So I'll put the Rambler up on the lift and we can try to knock out this exhaust, and then we can move on to all the other stuff we got to get done. All right, so I threw the exhaust back in and it looks pretty good. I actually put some heat shielding on the floor, and then I put some heat shielding kind of where this cross member is by the transmission. Turned out pretty good, but one thing that we're kind of having a problem with is we ran the exhaust originally kind of going back right out the side, and we did that because we had our fuel cell here and we were really tight on space. But now that we don't have our fuel cell there, we're thinking it might be a little bit easier to service if we actually make a exhaust going out behind the rear wheel a little bit farther. I'll probably end up cutting this off and then making a different exhaust going out the back real quick, and then I'm gonna have to pull it back down and paint it. But I think this will be a lot easier to do in the long run, so I'm gonna just knock it out right now. So I'm going to cut these two tubes off, and then I'm gonna actually put a V-band behind it so that way we can pull it off. And then I'm gonna make a pipe going all the way out almost to the back of the car, coming out right in this corner on both sides. So I think that'll look a little bit better, and it'll be a lot easier to get to the diff and everything else if we have a V-band here. Alright, so this is kind of what we're doing here. So we're gonna come up and then back out, and then we're gonna do a turn down in the back corner. So I think that'll look pretty cool, and it helps us out because this is coming straight back now, so it's not gonna hit any of the suspension. And that's kind of where the original Corvette exhaust was. That should all pretty much be the same as stock. So I think this turned out pretty good. The only problem is, if you can see up here, our fuel lines are really close to this, so I'm definitely gonna have to make a heat shield coming between that. Not a huge deal, I think it'll be okay, but of course, the one spot where I wanted to run the exhaust is where the fuel lines are, but that I think will buy us a lot more room underneath and it'll look a lot better. So we're gonna finish tacking this thing up, do the other side, and I'll show you guys how it looks. All right, so that's what it's gonna look like. We just went with the dump kind of out the side, and then straight back, and then to the exhaust there. So we gotta replicate that on the other side, and then we got our hanger here. So it's gonna be a lot nicer. We have two V-bands, so we can just unbolt this whole thing, and it'll come right out. So starting to mess with the passenger side of the car, and one thing I realized, and didn't realize it before, this side actually is notched out for the filler neck to go in, and then this side is not. So whenever you put the exhaust, it actually hits that corner of where the gas tank is. So what we're gonna do is actually curve it over so that way it can come back around and then come out the same spot as that side and try to miss this corner here. So a little bit more work. It's not going to be exactly symmetrical, but it'll clear and we won't have any clearance issues over here. So didn't even notice that corner, but we're going to try to make it work. All right, so you can kind of see what we're doing. We have this bend going around this way, so it kind of jumps over that corner so that we can come straight out to the corner of the car, just like this side. So a little bit more than just a straight shot like that one was. That one obviously was the easier side, but we'll make this work and it'll look symmetrical from the outside. Just a little bit of a bend on the inside. Alright guys, so this is how the exhaust turned out. I'm pretty happy with the way that it came out. I think it looks pretty cool. So instead of going right behind the rear tire, we have it shooting all the way back out the rear bumper, kinda almost to the rear bumper. We kind of angled the pipe a little bit so it blows outside, but it isn't under the car. It'll not fill up the cab with fumes and stuff. So we have them both the same on both sides, except for that little turn we had to do right here. But we got it all painted and it's installed. So the underneath is basically done. We have everything tied up underneath. We have our coilovers, we changed the diff fluid, we put our drive shaft in, we put the exhaust in. So we're ready to go underneath. Now we got to start working on the interior, and the interior has always been a big problem with the Rambler, especially with sound. This thing was super loud when you go down the road because we have no sound deadener in it. So we're going to try to throw some sound deadener in here to quiet it down when we go on our road trip. So I'll show you guys what we're going to use for the sound deadener in the Rambler. All right, so in the dashboard, we are going with the Amazon Basic sound deadener. It's the most affordable stuff, and we tried it in the Willys and it worked really well. So we're going to use it again. So basically what we're going to do is cut this stuff out and then stick it all over the firewall and probably the floors and tunnel also. So that way we can have this thing sound deadened whenever we go to put our interior in, it'll already be done. So I gotta put all this stuff on here, then we can see how it looks and then go ahead and start wiring this thing. So that way we can get all that stuff run. All right, now that we got our sound deadener installed, we're going to move on to the wiring part of the Rambler, and that's gonna take the most time. So I wanna try to get this thing wired up so that way we don't have to rush this thing, because it takes a long time to get the thing wired correctly, and that was one of the biggest problems with this thing whenever we first put it together. So a big part of the wiring is the dash and the gauges. So I want to try to knock that stuff out, and we're going to do something really, really cool with the dash and gauges. So I'll show you guys what we're going to do. I think you guys are really going to like it. All right, so now we're going to move on to the gauges in the Rambler. So we were trying to figure out what kind of gauges we want to put in this thing. Now the Rambler has some really weird gauges in it. So these are the original gauges that were originally in the car. And the weird thing about these is it's actually an oval shape. So I was trying to think maybe we can make these work with the LS swap. And so I reached out to a company called Speed Hut. Now Speed Hut sells a product called the Speed Box. Basically, the transmission that we have in the Rambler has an electronic speedometer, and the speed box basically will take that signal and spin the mechanical speedometer in the original gauge. So I thought that was what we were going to do. So we have our speedometer here, we have just lights for our oil and our generator light, we have temperature, and we have fuel. So we have most gauges on here, but we don't have a lot of other things that we'd have to end up putting gauges somewhere else. Like we really need a good oil pressure gauge and a good alternator gauge and some stuff like that, so that this gauge doesn't really offer. So I was thinking we were gonna make the original gauges work, and back and forth talking with Speed Hut, and we found this. So this is Speed Hut's Legends Icon gauge, and this is basically exactly what I need. So it has all the gauges that are in the Rambler that I would actually need, and it just plugs in electronically. You can actually do GPS, you can do a bunch of stuff with the speedometer. It has a trip meter, it has an odometer, everything that I would need to make the Rambler work with these. And the cool thing is it's actually an oval. And so this is the original bezel that goes around the gauges in the Rambler. And so we were thinking it would be really cool to use these, but then use them inside of the original Rambler bezel. So it just so happened that Speed Hut sells this, and I'm really stoked to be able to use this with this car. So for now, the background of this thing is just black, but Speed Hut actually does a bunch of custom gauges that you guys can do, and it's really, really neat. So we're actually gonna send this back to them, and they're gonna do a custom Rambler gauge for this. But for now, just to get us on Hot Rod Power Tour, we're going with the standard black, and then we customize the text and the knobs and stuff. So we're going to throw this thing in, but it doesn't exactly fit with the Rambler gauge bezel. As you can see, it's a little bit smaller than the Rambler gauge bezel. So what we did was we actually used our ferro arm and we traced the inside bezel of this, so that way we could get the profile of this. And we were thinking we were going to end up building the edge up and making it kind of offset in the middle, but it was a really, really complicated shape, and it was really difficult to do, especially in the time crunch that we have for Power Tour. So we went with the original gauge, and we decided to mount it from the back. So what we did was we designed a little trim piece like this to be able to convert the Speed Hut gauges to the Rambler gauges. And this turned out really, really nice. We actually implemented the style of the buttons. So we have two buttons on each side. One's gonna be our AC button and one's gonna be our line lock button. And we tried to style the buttons off of the original Rambler knobs that are in the dash, so it looks kind of cohesive. And then we water jetted a little clamp around the back, so this will clamp the speed hut gauge in place, and then this will go right inside of the Rambler gauge bezel like that, and then we'll have our speed hut dash in there. So that's what we're gonna do with the gauges on the Rambler. Big thanks to Speed Hut for helping us out with all this stuff and getting this ordered and everything to make this thing work in a time crunch. Now we are gonna be doing some really cool things with Speed Hut in the future in the next couple months, so make sure you stay tuned so you can see all the stuff we're gonna be doing with the Rambler and with Speed Hut gauges. But let's put this thing in the dash and see how this thing looks. Alright guys, so this is how our dash came out, and I'm really happy with the way this came out. I'm giving you guys a little bit of a sneak peek of it installed in the Rambler. You'll have to wait for the next episode to see all the wiring stuff, but this is how the dash looks in the Rambler, and it turned out really cool. So you can see it's backlit with our lights and stuff. We have all of our gauges here all lit up, and we installed 2 buttons here, so these will actually illuminate. We haven't gotten these wired yet, but this is going to be one for our air conditioning and then one for our line lock. I think it turned out really cool. A lot of little details that kind of match the original Rambler, but have some cool modern gauges with it also. So it has all the modern conveniences you'd have in a normal car in an old car like this. So that's really, really awesome. I think it came out pretty cool. But that's going to do it for this episode of Rustomod, guys. Make sure you follow along so you can stay up to date with all the episodes we have here. We're getting down to the wire on time here with this thing. We literally have 1 more week to go until we leave for Power Tour, so we got a lot of work to do in a short amount of time. But we'll get this thing done, and we'll see you guys on Power Tour this year. So make sure you like, comment, subscribe so you can stay up to date with all the content we have coming your way, and we'll see you guys on the next episode.